Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with a little bit more philosophy. Today we are diving into the works of Georg Hegel. This is The Science of Logic. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and the link for my book, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, let us dive in and continue our exploration of Georg Hegel's The Science of Logic with Part 3, The Essential Relation. The truth of appearance is the essential relation. Its content has immediate self-subsistence, the existent immediacy, and the reflected immediacy, or the self-identical reflection. In this self-subsistence, however, it is at the same time a relative content. It is simply and solely as a reflection into its other, or as unity of the reference with its other. In this unity, the self-subsistent content is something posited, sublated. But precisely this unity is what constitutes its essentiality and self-subsistence. This reflection into an other is reflection into itself. The reflection has sides, since it is reflection into an other, so its difference is internal to it, and its sides are independent subsistence. For, in their mutually indifferent diversity, they are thrown back into themselves, so that the subsistence of each equally has its meaning only in its reference to the other, or in the negative unity of both. The essential relation is, therefore, not yet the true third to essence and to concrete existence, but already contains the determinate union of the two. Essence is realized in it in such a way that it has self-subsistent, concrete existence for its subsistence. And these concrete existence have returned from their indifference back into their essential unity, so that they have only this unity as their subsistence. Also, the reflective determinations of positive and negative are reflected into themselves only as each is reflected into its opposite. But they have no other determination besides their negative unity. Whereas the essential relation has sides that are posited as self-subsistent totalities. It is the same opposition as that of positive and negative, but it is such as an inverted world. The side of the essential relation is a totality which, however, essentially has an opposite or a beyond. It is only appearance, its concrete existence, rather than being its own. It is that of its other. It is, therefore, something internally fractured. But this, its sublated being, consists in its being the unity of itself and its other. Therefore, a whole. And precisely for this reason, it has self-subsistent, concrete existence and is essential reflection into itself. This is the concept of relation. At first, however, the identity it contains is not yet perfect. The totality which each relative is as relative is only an inner one. The side of relation is posited at first in one of the determinations of negative unity. What constitutes the form of the relation is the specific self-subsistence of each of the two sides. The identity of the form is therefore only a reference, and the self-subsistence of the sides falls outside it. That is to say, it falls in the sides. We still do not have the reflected unity of the identity of the relation and of the self-subsistent concrete existence. We still do not have a substance. It follows that the concept of relation has indeed shown itself to be the unity of reflected and immediate self-subsistence. But it is this concept still immediately at first. Immediate are therefore its moments vis-a-vis each other, and immediate is the unity of the reference connecting them essentially. A unity, this, which only then is the true unity that conforms to the concept when it has realized itself, that is to say, through its movement has posited itself as this unity. The essential relation is, therefore, immediately the relation of the whole and the parts, the reference of reflected and immediate self-subsistence, so that both are at the same time mutually conditioning and presupposing. In this relation, neither of the sides is yet posited as moment of the other. Their identity is therefore itself one side, or not their negative unity. Hence, secondly, the relation passes over into one which is one side is the movement of the other and is present there as its ground, the true self-subsistent element of both. This is the relation of force and its expression. Third, the inequality still present in this reference sublates itself, and the final relation is that of inner and outer. In this difference, which has now become totally formal, relation itself founders, and substance or actuality comes on the stage as the absolute unity of immediate and reflected concrete existence. A. The relation of whole and parts. First, the essential relation contains the self-subsistence of concrete existence reflected into itself. It is then the simple form whose determinations are indeed also concrete existences, but they are posited at the same time, moments held in the unity. This self-subsistence reflected into itself is at the same time reflection into its opposite, namely the immediate self-subsistence, and its subsistence is this identity with its opposite, no less than its own self-subsistence. Second, the other side is thereby also immediately posited. This is the immediate self-subsistence, which, determined as the other, is in itself a multifarious manifold, but in such a way that this manifold also essentially has within it the reference to the other side, the unity of the reflected self-subsistence. That one side, the whole, is the self-subsistence that constitutes the world, existing in and for itself. The other side, the parts. It is the immediate concrete existence which was the world of appearance, and the relation of whole and parts. The two sides are these self-subsistences, but in such a way that each has the other reflectively shining in it, and at the same time it only is as the identity of both. Now, because the essential relation is at first only the first immediate relation, the negative unity and the positive self-subsistence are bound together by the also. The two sides are indeed both posited as moments, but equally so as concretely existing self-subsistences. Their being posited as moments is henceforth so distributed that the whole, the reflected self-subsistence, is as concrete self-existent first, and the other, the immediate, is in it as a moment. The whole constitutes here the unity of its two sides, the substrate, and the immediate concrete existence is as positedness. Conversely, on the other side, which is the side of the parts, the immediate and internally manifold concrete existence is the self-subsistent substrate, the reflected unity. The whole is, on the contrary, only external reference. Okay, so just briefly, what this appears to be stating is something along the lines of, this is my body, right? This, as the whole, constitutes my body, but it is made up of parts. Some of those parts are fingernails. I use fingernails all of the time because that is a good comparison to the scope of you in relation to the infinite, right? The fingernail is definitely a part of my body. It is identified as my body, but it is a part. It is self-existent in itself. You can pull this off of my body and it will still be a fingernail, no longer attached to where it came from. But it is still a fingernail. It is existent for itself, but it is part of me. It doesn't define me. I am not defined by my fingernail, but it is definitely part of me. And without fingernails, I would have a different designation than I do as a being with fingernails. That is basically what is being posited here, right? The whole contains all of the parts, but the parts are not necessarily the whole defined. That's about as close as I can probably get so far, but most of this is probably going to be a reiteration of that, right? The clarifying of terms. George is really good with clarifying terms. I love it, but there's not normally a whole lot for me to add to what he says because most of it is self-existent or self-explanatory as we read, but sometimes I try to bring in at least a little bit of an example. All right, back to the text. 2. This relation thus contains the self-subsistence of the sides, and their whole sublatedness no less, and the two simply in one reference. The whole is the self-subsistence. The parts are only moments of this unity, but they are also equally self-subsistent, and their reflected unity is only a moment. And each is, in its self-subsistence, simply the relative of another. This relation is within it, therefore, immediate contradiction, and it sublates itself. On closer inspection, the whole is the reflected unity that stands independently on its own. But the subsistence that belongs to it is equally repelled by it. It is thus self-externalized. It has its subsistence in its opposite, in the manifold immediacy, the parts. The whole thus consists of the parts, and apart from them it is not anything. It is therefore the whole relation and the self-subsistent totality, but for precisely this reason, it is only a relative, for what makes it a totality is rather its other. The parts, it does not have its subsistence within it, but in its other. The parts, too, are likewise the whole relation. They are the immediate as against the reflected self-subsistence, and do not subsist in the whole, but are for themselves. Further, they have this whole within them as their moment. The whole constitutes their connecting reference. Without the whole, there are no parts. Now, because they are self-subsistent, this connection is only an external moment with respect to which they are in and for themselves indifferent. But at the same time, the parts, as manifold concrete existence, collapse together, for this concrete existence is reflectionless being. They have their self-subsistence only in the reflected unity, which is this unity as well as the concrete existent manifoldness. This means that they have self-subsistence only in the whole, but this whole is at the same time the self-subsistence which is the other to the parts. The whole and the parts thus reciprocally condition each other, but the relation here considered is at the same time higher than the reference of conditioned and condition to each other as earlier determined. Here, this reference is realized, that is to say, it is posited that the condition is the essential self-subsistence of the conditioned, in such a manner that it is presupposed by the latter. The condition, as such, is only the immediate, and it is only implicitly presupposed. But the whole, through the contradiction of the parts, itself immediately entails that it, too, is only in so far as it has the parts for presupposition. Thus, since both sides of the relation are posited as conditioning each other reciprocally, each is on its own and immediate self-subsistence, but their self-subsistence is equally mediated or posited through the other. The whole relation, because of this reciprocity, is the turning back of the conditioning into itself, the non-relative, the unconditioned. But now, inasmuch as each side of the relation has its self-subsistence not in it, but in its other, what we have is only one identity of the two, in which they are both only moments. But inasmuch as each is self-subsistent on its own, the two are two self-subsistent concrete existences, indifferent to each other. In the first respect, that of the essential identity of the two sides, the whole is equal to the parts and the parts are equal to the whole. Nothing is in the whole which is not in the parts, and nothing is in the parts which is not in the whole. The whole is not an abstract unity, but the unity of a diversified manifoldness. But this unity, within which the manifold is held together, is the determinateness by virtue of which the latter is the parts. The relation has, therefore, an indivisible identity and only one self-subsistence. But further, the whole is equal to the parts, but not to them as parts. The whole is the reflected unity, whereas the parts constitute the determinate moment, or the otherness of the unity, and are the diversified manifold. The whole is not equal to them as this self-subsistent diversity, but to them together. But this, their together, is nothing else but their unity, the whole as such. In the parts, therefore, the whole is only equal to itself, and the equality of it and the parts expresses only this tautology, namely, the whole as whole is equal, not to the parts, but to the whole. Conversely, the parts are equal to the whole, but because, as parts, they are moments of otherness, they are not equal to it as the unity, but in such a way that one of the whole's manifold determinations maps over a part, or that they are equal to the whole as manifold. And this is to say that they are equal to it as an apportioned whole, that is, as parts. Here, we thus have the same tautology, that the parts as parts are equal, not to the whole as such, but in the whole, to themselves. The whole and the parts, thus, fall indifferently apart. Each side refers only to itself. But, as so held apart, they destroy themselves. The whole, which is indifferent towards the parts, is abstract identity, undifferentiated in itself. Identity is a whole only inasmuch as it is differentiated in itself. So differentiated indeed that the manifold determinations are reflected into themselves and have immediate self-subsistence. And the identity of reflection has shown through its movement that it has this reflection into its other for its truth. In just the same way are the parts as indifferent to the unity of the whole, only the unconnected manifold, the inherently other, which, as such, is the other of itself and only sublates itself. This self-reference of each of the two sides is their self-subsistence. But this self-subsistence which each side has for itself is rather the negation of their respective selves. Each side has its self-subsistence, therefore, not within, but in the other side. This other, which constitutes the subsistence, is its presupposed immediate, which is supposed to be the first, and is starting point. But this first of each side is itself only a first, which is not first, but has its beginning in its other. The truth of the relation consists, therefore, in the mediation. Its essence is the negative unity in which both the reflected and the existent immediacy are equally sublated. The relation is the contradiction that returns to its ground, into the unity which, as turning back, is reflected unity, but which, since it has equally posited itself as sublated, refers to itself negatively, and makes itself into existent immediacy. But this unity's negative reference, insofar as it is a first and an immediate, only is as mediated by its other and equally as posited. This other, this existent immediacy, is equally only as sublated. Its self-subsistence is a first, but only in order to disappear, and it has an existence which is posited and mediated. Determined in this way, the relation is no longer one of whole and parts. the previous immediacy of its sides has passed over into positedness and mediation. Each side is posited insofar as it is immediate, as self-sublating, and as passing over into the other, and insofar as it is itself negative reference. It is at the same time posited as conditioned through the other as through its positive. And the same applies to the immediate transition of each. It is equally a mediation, a sublating, which is posited through the other. Thus, the relation of whole and parts has passed over into the relation of force and its expressions. Remark. The antinomy of the infinite divisibility of matter was examined above in connection with the concepts of quantity. Quantity is the unity of continuity and discreteness. It contains in the self-subsistent one of its confluence with others, and in this uninterrupted continuing self-identity, it equally contains the negation of it. Inasmuch as the immediate connection of these moments of quantity find expression in the essential relation of whole and parts, the one of quantity being part, and its continuity the whole, which is composed of parts, the antinomy consists in the contradiction that was incurred, and was resolved, in conjunction with the relation of whole and parts. For whole and parts are just as essentially related to one another and constitute only one identity, as they are indifferent to each other, having independent subsistence. The relation, therefore, is this antinomy, that the one moment, in freeing itself from the other, immediately brings about this other. The concrete existent, then, determined as a whole, has parts, and these constitute this subsistence. The unity of the whole is a positive connection, an external composition which is extraneous to the self-subsistent concrete existent. Now, if such a concrete existent is a part, then it is not the whole, it is not composed, hence is a simple. But the reference to the whole is external to it, and therefore extraneous. It follows that the self-subsistent in itself is also not a part, for it is a part only by virtue of that connecting reference. But now, since it is not part, it is a whole. For this relation of whole and parts is the only one that there is, and the self-subsistent is one of the two. But as a whole it is again composed. It again consists of parts, and so on, to infinity. This infinity consists in nothing else but the perennial alternation of the two determinations of the relation, in each of which the other immediately arises, so that the positiveness of one is the disappearing of itself. Determined as a whole, matter consists of parts, and in these whole become an unessential connection. It disappears. But a part, thus taken on its own, is also not a part of the whole. The antinomy of this inference, on close inspection, is really this. Since the whole is not what subsists on its own, the part is the self-subsistent. But since the latter is self-subsistent only without the whole, it is then self-subsistent not as a part, but rather as a whole. The infinitude of the ensuing progress is the incapacity to bring together the two thoughts which this mediation entails, namely, that each of the two determinations, by virtue of its self-subsistence and separation from the other, passes over into a non-self-subsistence and into the other. B. The relation of force and its expression. Force is the negative unity into which the contradiction of whole and parts has resolved itself. It is the truth of that first relation. That of whole and parts is the thoughtless relation which the understanding first happens to come up with, or, objectively speaking, it is a dead mechanical aggregate that indeed has formed determinations, and brings the manifoldness of its self-subsisting matter together into one unity. but this unity is external to the manifoldness. But the relation of force is the higher immanent turning back, in which the unity of the whole that made up the connection of the self-subsisting otherness ceases to be something external and indifferent to this manifoldness. In the essential relation as now determined, the immediate and the reflected self-subsistence are now posited in that manifoldness as sublated, or as moments, whereas in the preceding relation they were self-subsisting sides or extremes. In this, there is contained, first, that the reflected unity and its immediate existence, in so far as they are both first and immediate, sublate themselves and pass over into their other. The former, force, passes over into its expression, and what is expressed is a disappearing something that returns into force as its ground, and only exists as supported and posited by it. Second, this transition is not only a becoming, a becoming and a disappearing, but is rather negative reference to itself. That is, that which alters its determination is, in this altering, reflected into itself and preserves itself. The movement of force is not as much a transition as a translation. And in this alteration, posited though itself, it remains what it is. Posited through itself, it remains what it is. Third, this reflected self-referring unity is itself also sublated, and a moment. It is mediated through its other, and it has this as condition. Its negative self-reference, which is a first, and begins the movement of the transition out of itself, has equally a presupposition by which it is solicited, and another from which it begins. A. The conditionedness of force. Considered in its closer determinations, force contains, first, the moment of existing immediacy. It itself is determined over against this immediacy as negative unity. But this unity, in the determination of immediate being, is an existing something. This something appears as a first, since as an immediate it is negative unity. Force, on the contrary, since it is a reflected something, appears as a positiveness, and to this extent is pertaining to the existing thing or to a matter. Not that force is the form of this thing, and the thing is determined by it. On the contrary, the thing is as an immediate indifferent to it. As so determined, there is no ground in the thing for having a force. Force, on the other hand, since it is the side of positiveness, presupposes the thing essentially. If it is therefore asked, how the thing or matter happens to have a force, the latter appears as externally connected to it and impressed upon the thing by some alien power. As this immediate subsistence, force is a quiescent determinateness of the thing, in general, not anything that expresses itself, but something immediately external. Hence, for this force is also designated as matter, and instead of a magnetic force and an electric force and other such forces, a magnetic matter, an electronic matter, and so on are assumed. Or, again, instead of the renowned force of attraction, a fine ether is assumed that holds everything together. These are the matters which we considered above, into which the inert, powerless, negative unity of the thing dissolved itself. But force contains immediate, concrete existence as a moment, one which, though a condition, is transient and self-sublating. It contains it, therefore, not as a concretely existing thing. Further, it is not negation as determinateness, but negative unity reflected into itself. Consequently, the thing where the force was supposed to be no longer has any significance here. The force itself is rather the positing of the externality that appears as concrete existence. It also no longer is, therefore, merely a determinate matter. Such self-subsistence has long since passed over into positiveness and appearance. Second, force is the unity of reflected and immediate subsistence, or of form unity and external self-subsistence. It is both in one. It is the contact of sides of which one is insofar as the other is not. Self-identical positive reflection and negated reflection. Force is thus self-repelling contradiction. It is active, or it is self-referring negative unity in which the reflected immediacy or the essential in itselfness is posited as being only as sublated or as a moment, and consequently, insofar as it distinguishes itself from immediate concrete existence as passing over into it. Force, as the determination of the reflected unity of the whole, is thus posited as becoming concretely existent external manifoldness from out of itself. But, third, force is activity at first only in principle and immediately. It is reflected unity, and just as essentially, the negation of it. Inasmuch as it differs from this unity, but is only the identity of itself and its negation, it essentially refers to this identity as an immediate external to it, and one which has a presupposition and condition. Now, this presupposition is not a thing standing over against it. In force, any such indifferent self-subsistence is sublated. As the condition of force, the thing is a self-subsistent other to it. And because it is not a thing, and the self-subsistent immediacy has, on the contrary, attained here the determination of self-referring negative unity, the self-subsistent other is itself a force. The activity of force is conditioned through itself as through another, to itself through a force. Accordingly, force is a relation in which each side is at the same as the other. They are forces that stand in relation and refer to each other essentially. Further, they are different at first only in general. The unity of their relation is at first one which is internal and exists only implicitly. The conditionedness of a force through another force is thus the doing of the force in itself. That is, the force is at first a positing act as presupposing, an act that only negatively refers to itself. The other force still lies beyond its positing activity, namely, the reflection that in its determining immediacy turns into itself. B. The solicitation of force. Force is conditioned because the moment of immediate concrete existence, which it contains, is something only posited, but because it is at the same time an immediate, is posited as something presupposed, in which the force negates itself. Accordingly, the externality which is present to force is its own activity of presupposing, posited at first as another force. This presupposing is moreover reciprocal. Each of the two forces containing the unity reflected into itself as sublated, and is therefore a presupposing. It posits itself as external. This moment of externality is its own, but since it is equally a unity reflected into itself, it posits that externality at the same time, not within itself, but as another force. But the external as such is self-sublating. Further, the activity that reflects itself into itself essentially refers to that externality as to its other, but equally to it as to something which is null in itself and identical with it. Since the presupposing activity is equally immanent reflection, it sublates that negative external negation, and posits it as something external to it, or as its externality. Thus, force, as conditioning, is reciprocally a stimulus for the other force against which it is active. The attitude of each force is not one of passive determination, as if something other than it were thereby being elicited in it. The stimulus, rather, only solicits it. The force is within it the negativity of itself. The repelling of itself from itself is its own positing. Its act, therefore, consists in sublating the externality of the stimulus, reducing it to just a stimulus, and positing it as its own repelling of itself from itself, as its own expression. The force that expresses itself is thus the same as what was at first a presupposing activity, that is, one which makes itself external, but as self-expressive. Force also negates externality and posits it as its own activity. Now, in as far as this examination, we start from force as the negative unity of itself, and, consequently, as presupposing reflection. This is the same as when, in the expression of force, we start from the soliciting stimulus. Thus, force is, in its concept, as first determined as self-sublating identity, and, in its reality, one of the two forces that is determined as soliciting, and the other as being solicited. But the concept of force is, as such, the identity of positing and presupposing reflection, or of reflected and immediate unity, and each of these determinations is simply a moment in unity, and consequently is as mediated through the other. But equally so, there is nothing in the two forces, thus alternately referring to each other, that determines which would be the soliciting and which the solicited. Or, rather, both of these form determinations belong to each in equal manner. And this identity is not just one of external comparison, but an essential unity of the two. Thus, one force is determined as soliciting and the other as being solicited. These determinations of form appear in this guise as two differences present in the forces immediately, but they are essentially mediated. The one force is solicited, the stimulus, is a determination posited in it from outside, but the force is itself a presupposing. It essentially reflects into itself and sublates the fact that the stimulus is something external. That it is solicited is thus its own doing, or it is through its own determining that the other force is another force, in general, and the one soliciting. The soliciting force refers to the other negatively, and so sublates its externality and is positing. But it is only thus positing only on the presupposition that it has an other over against it. That is to say, it is itself soliciting only to the extent that it has an externality in it, and hence to the extent that it is solicited. Or it is soliciting only to the extent that it is solicited to be soliciting. And so, conversely, the first is solicited only to the extent that it is itself solicits the other to solicit it, that is, the first force. Each, thus, receives the stimulus from the other, but the stimulus that each delivers as active consists in receiving a stimulus from the other. The stimulus which it receives is solicited by itself. Both the given and the received stimulus, or the active expression and the passive externality, are each, therefore, nothing immediate, but are mediated. Indeed, each force is itself the determinateness which the other has over against it, is mediated through this other. And this mediating other is, again, its own determining positing. This, then, that a force happens to incur a stimulus through another force, that it therefore behaves passively, but then again passes over from this passivity into activity. This is the turning back of force into itself. Force expresses itself. The external expression is a reaction in the sense that it posits the externality as its own moment, and thus sublates its having been solicited through another force. The two are therefore one, the expression of the force by virtue of which the latter, through its negative activity, which is directed at itself, imparts a determinate being for other to itself, and the infinite turning back in this externality back to itself, so that it only refers to itself. The presupposing reflection, to which belongs the conditionedness and the stimulus, is therefore immediately also the reflection that returns into itself, and the activity is essentially reactive against itself. The positing of the stimulus, or the external, is itself the sublation of it, and, conversely, the sublation of the stimulus is the positing of the externality. C. The infinity of force. Force is finite, inasmuch as its moments still have the form of immediacy. In this determination, its presupposing and its self-referring reflection are different. The one appears as an external self-subsisting force, and the other as passively referring to it. Force is thus still conditioned according to form, and according to content, likewise, still restricted. For a determinateness of form still entails a restriction of content. But the activity of force consists in expressing itself, that is, as we have seen, in sublating the externality and determining it as that in which it is identical with itself. What force truly expresses, therefore, that its reference to another is its reference to itself, that its passivity consists in its activity. The stimulus by virtue of which it is solicited to activity is its own soliciting. The externality that comes to it is nothing immediate but something mediated by it, just as its own essential self-identity is not immediate, but is mediated by virtue of its negation. In brief, force expresses this, that its externality is identical with its inwardness. C. Relation of outer and inner. 1. The relation of whole and parts is the immediate relation. In it, therefore, reflected and existent immediacy have a self-subsistence of their own. But now, since they stand in essential relation, their self-subsistence is their negative unity, and this is now posited in the expression of force. The reflected unity is essentially a becoming other, the unity's translation of itself into externality. But this externality is just as immediately taken back into that unity. The difference of the self-subsisting forces sublates itself. The expression of force is only a mediation of the reflected unity with itself. What is present is only an empty and transparent difference, a reflective shine. But this shine is the mediation, which is precisely the independent subsistence. What we have is not just opposite determinations openly sublating themselves, and their movement is not only a transition. Rather, what we have is both that the immediacy from which the start and the transition into otherness were made is itself only posited, and that, consequently, each of the determinations is already in its immediacy, the unity with its other, so that the transition equally is a self-positing turning back into itself. The inner is determined as the form of reflected immediacy, or of essence, over against the outer as the form of being. The two, however, are only one identity. This identity is, first, the sustaining unity of the two as substrate, replete of content, or the absolute fact with respect to which the two determinations are indifferent, external moments. To this extent, it is content and totality. A totality which is an inner that has equally become an outer, but in this outer is not something that has become or something that has been left behind, but self-equal. The outer, in this determination, is not only equal to the inner according to content, but the two are rather only one fact. But this fact, as simple identity with itself, is different from its form determinations, or these determinations are external to it. It is itself, therefore, an inner, which is different from its externality. But this externality consists in the two determinations, the inner and the outer, both constituting it. But the fact is nothing other than the unity of the two. Again, therefore, the two sides are the same according to content. But in the fact they are as self-penetrating identity, as substrate full of content. But in the externality, as forms of the fact, they are indifferent to that identity, and consequently, each is indifferent to the other. 2. They are in this wise the different form determinations that have an identical substrate, but not in them, but in another. These are determinations of reflection, which are each for itself. The inner, as the form of immanent reflection, the form of essentiality. The outer, as the form of, instead of, immediacy, reflected into another, or the form of unessentiality. But the nature of a relation has shown that these determinations constitute just one identity alone. In its expression, force is a determining, which is one and the same as presupposing, as returning into itself. Inasmuch as the inner and the outer are considered as determinations of form, they are, therefore, first, only the simple form itself, and second, because in this form they are at the same time determined as opposite, their unity is the pure abstract determination in which the one is immediately the other. And is this outer because it is the one that it is? Thus, the inner is immediately only the outer, and it is this determinateness of externality, for the reason that it is the inner. Conversely, the outer is only an inner because it is only an outer. In other words, since the unity of form holds its two determinations as opposites, their identity is only this transition, and is in this transition only the other of both, not their identity replete with content, or this holding fast to form is, in general, the side of determinateness. What is determined according to this side is not the real totality of the whole, but the totality, or the fact itself, only in the determinacy of forms. Since this unity is simply the coincidence of two opposed determinations, then, when one of them is taken first, it is indifferent which, it must be said of the substrate, or the fact, that it is for this reason just as essentially in the other determinateness, but also only in the other, just as it was first said that it is only in the first. Thus, something which is at first only an inner is, for just that reason, only an outer. Or conversely, something which is only an outer is, for that reason, only an inner. Or, if the inner is determined as essence, but the outer as being, then it is inasmuch as a fact is only in its essence. It is, for that very reason, only an immediate being, or a fact which only is for the very reason, as yet, only its existence, its essence. Outer and inner are determinateness so posited that each, as a determination, not only presupposes the other and passes over into it as its truth, but in being this truth of the other, remains posited as determinateness and points to the totality of both. The inner is thus the completion of essence according to form. For in being determined as inner, essence implies that it is deficient, and that it is only with reference to this other, this outer. But this other is not just being, or even concrete existence, but is the reference to essence, or the inner. What we have here is not just the reference of the two to each other, but the determining element of absolute form, namely, that each term is immediately its opposite, and each is their common reference to a third, or rather to their unity. Their mediation, however, still misses this identical substrate that contains them both. Their reference is, for this reason, the immediate conversion of the one into the other. And this negative unity tying them together is the simple point, empty of content. Remark. The movement of essence is, in general, the coming to be of the concept. In the relation of inner and outer, the essential moment of the concept comes on stage, namely that its determinations are so posited in negative unity that each not only is its other immediately, but is also the totality of the whole. And the concept as such, however, this totality is the universal, a substrate which is still absent in the relation of inner and outer. Also missing in the negative unity of inner and outer, which is the immediate conversion of the one determination into the other, is that substrate which we have called the fact. The immediate identity of form, as has been posited here, still without the rich content of the movement of the fact itself, merits close attention. It occurs in the fact as the latter is at its beginning. This pure being is immediately nothing. Quite in general, everything real is at its beginning only an immediate identity of this sort, for at this stage it has not yet opposed and developed its moments. On the one hand, it has not yet inwardly recollected itself from externality. On the other, it has not yet relinquished its inwardness, not yet produced itself out of it. It is, therefore, the inner only as determinateness against the outer, and the outer only as determinateness against the inner. Hence, it is partly only an immediate being, and partly, since it is equally the negativity which will be the activity of development, is as such still essentially only an inner. This is manifest, quite in general, in every natural, scientific, and spiritual development, and is essential to recognize that because something is at first only an inner, or also in its concept, as a first, it is for that reason it's only its immediate passive existence. Thus, just to take the nearest example, the essential relation now under consideration, before going through the mediation of the relation of force and thus realizing itself, is relation only in itself, is the conception of relation, or relation only implicitly. But for that reason, it is only the external, immediate relation, the relation of whole and parts, in which the sides have indifferent subsistence vis-a-vis each other. Their identity is not yet explicit in them. It is implicit at first. And for this reason, they fall apart. They have an immediate external subsistence. Thus, the sphere of being is in general, and only, the absolutely still inner. And for this reason, the sphere of existent immediacy, or of externality. Essence, or Wesen in German, is only the inner at first. Hence, it is also taken for a totally external and unsystematic common element. One speaks, in German, of Schulwesen, Zeitwissen, Zeitungswesen, that is, of public instruction, of the press, and understands by it a common something made up of existing objects externally assembled together, with no essential bond or organization, or with regard to concrete objects. The seed of a plant is at first only inner plant, or the child only implicitly human. But this is why the plant, or the human being, is, as germ, an immediate, something external which has not yet given itself negative self-reference, is something passive, the prey to otherness. Also, God, in his immediate concept, is not spirit. Spirit is not an immediate, is not opposed to mediation, but is essence, externally positing its immediacy, and externally, eternally returning from it back into itself. Immediately, therefore, God is only nature, or nature is God only as the inner God, not the God who is actual spirit and hence is not the true God, or as first thought, God is only the pure being, or also essence, the abstract absolute, but not God as absolute spirit, which alone is the true nature of God. 3. The first of the identities considered, the identity of inner and outer, is the substrate which is indifferent to the difference of these determinations as to a form external to it, or the identity is as content. The second is the unmediated identity of their difference, the immediate conversion of each into its opposite, or it is inner and outer as pure form. But both these identities are only the sides of one totality, or the totality itself is only the conversion of the one identity into the other. The totality, as substrate and content, is this immediacy, reflected into itself only through the presupposing reflection of form that sublates their difference, and posits itself as indifferent identity, as reflected unity over against it. Or, again, the content is the form itself insofar as the latter determines itself as difference, and makes itself into one side of this difference as externality, but into the other side as an immediacy, which is reflected into itself, or into an inner. It follows that, conversely, the differences of form, the inner and the outer, are each posited as the totality within itself, of itself, and its other. The inner, as simple identity reflected into itself, is immediacy, and hence no less than essence, being, and externality. And the external, as the manifold and determined being, is only external, that is, as posited as unessential, and having returned to its ground, therefore as inner. The transition of each into the other is their immediate identity, as substrate, but also their mediated identity, that is, each is what it is in itself, the totality of the relation, precisely through its other. Or, conversely, the determinateness of each side is mediated through the determinateness of the other, because each is in itself the totality. The totality, thus, mediates itself with itself through the form, or the determinateness, and the determinateness mediates itself with itself through its simple identity. Therefore, what something is, that it is entirely in its externality. Its externality is its totality, and equally so, its unity reflected into itself. Its appearance is not only self-reflection into other, but immanent reflection. And this externality is therefore the expression of what it is in itself. And since its content and its form are thus absolutely identical, it is, in and for itself, nothing but this, to express itself. It is the revealing of its essence, and this essence, accordingly, consists simply in being self-revealing. This essential relation, in this identity of appearance with the inner, or with essence, has determined itself as actuality. And that is going to wrap up this section. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion. I didn't have a whole lot to add, but I do have a little bit to add on here. The force concept, right? Now, force isn't you acting upon generally and briefly, right? So you pushing is a force. Me pushing against this wall is a force. I am enacting a force. But the wall already has a force. It has a subsistence of its own, external from me, but it also resists my pushing, right? I am using my force to push against the wall. But if I don't have the resistance to push against, then the force really is a motion without an action. The resistance of even the atmosphere is the pushing against the force that I am giving. And so without the resistance, the force is not really. And that was what was being said. It wasn't quite clear as I would think, right? And that is just me reading this and extracting from it what I can. But it does seem to appear that without the oppositional force, then force doesn't really exist, right? The movement without opposition is not really movement, right? It is simply existing. If I push my hand and there's no resistance, my hand just moves. It's not really force. The resistance helps define the force. Most of the rest of this to me is self-explanatory, right? The existence of the parts as being the whole, but independent of the whole, we talked about with the fingernail. That works. The force needing a force against it, and neither of the forces being the determinant. That is important as well. The actuality of the thing is what is actuality in. And so that was pretty self-explanatory to me. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, follow. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. If you have clarifying marks, put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me read or discuss, drop that in the box as well. And if you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of my book. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pit Steak. Peace.